Although we know the power company today as Hydro-Quebec, there were several owners and name changes since the early 1900s. Starting in 1910, the power company was known as the Canadian Light and Power Company. Then it was the Montreal Light, Heat and Power Consolidated, Quebec Hydroelectric Commission, Cedar Rapids Manufacturing and Power Company, and finally Hydro-Quebec. There were 4 hydro lines and many towers imposed in Kahnawà since the early 1900s through various transactions authorized by the Canadian government. Each additional line required more land. In total, about 500 acres of Kahnawà land was expropriated, much more than what was actually needed. It's a complicated story, so we'll start with the recollections of a Kahnawà elder on the traditional territory of the Mohawks.
Well, there's a few things that I think the community should be aware of. Previous to 1832, the land between Augustin and Kahnawà was recognized as our homelands, as our territory, so to speak. And somewhere in in that period of time, they decided to circumvent the Lake St. Louis coming from Lake St. Francis waterway and developed and built a hydro plant there, you know. And so that's our territory. They never asked, they never compensated, they never did anything. They just took it as saying, well, it belongs to somebody else, because what had happened is that the government of Canada threw open the lands for settlement in about the 1830s for people coming in from Ireland and Scotland and whatnot, you know, because of the impoverishment that was there. So anyway, they took our lands, and that was the end of it. So when the hydro was complete, the lines were serving Montreal. So in order to get to Montreal, the line came through Kahnawà, you know, and then that's how they made their first encroachment and incursion into Kahnawà.
The oldest line, referred to as Line 4, is no longer in use. In 1910, the Department of Indian Affairs and Northern Development used the Indian Act to expropriate Kahnawà land on the western part of the reserve and sold it to the Canadian Light and Power Company.
What I know of it is it's the same thing that the people were always questioning as to why electricity would be passing through Kahnawà, and you know, and I know that there was some mention at that point in time that we didn't have any electricity in our community, in our homes and everything, and there was always the attempt to say, well, if we're going to let that line go through, then we should be getting free electricity. It was always a question of us getting free electricity for them putting that power line through our community. And when we say free electricity, that means the setting up the posts and everything like that. But, you know, it never transpired, and our people, I don't recall, though, if the people getting compensated.
From what I do know, where the towers went through, at the time, everybody had large parcels of land. So really, it only affected, I think they said 12 people in all. The rest, by today's standards, I think it's probably up to, say, maybe 50 people. The land has been subdivided and resold, and so now it's different. More people you're looking at the time was only 12, but there was it was the power of the government of its time, where they were able to go in, and this is where it was going. And there was arguments about because some people wanted more compensation than the other, but once they established the rate, it was a base rate for everyone, and that's so it went through. I believe there was a few Cedar Rapids company. There was a few companies that had owned it, and it was eventually to where it's at today with Hydro.
I think it was in the 19-teens. I did encounter a petition from the chiefs here at Kahnawà, and I don't remember who was involved exactly, but at that time it was understood that the hydro lines were already going to go through, and there was nothing the community could do to stop it. There was a request that that there would be some kind of industry set up next to the village in Kahnawà, a factory or something that would give people work. And that could use the electricity going through those hydro lines, because I think people in Kahnawà understood that land was being taken for the transportation of electricity, but that the community wasn't benefiting from that. And so I did get the sense that originally there was a request by the community for some way to benefit from these hydro lines going through, and that request was not granted as far as I can tell.
Yes, they knew. They said there's electricity line coming through. I remember they're talking about inquiring about getting hooked up for electricity, but it wasn't that kind of line. They said voltage is going to be really high. You know, they had no. The point is they didn't have no understanding about that particular part. I guess nobody really did.
If they did pay the community, they gave them a very small token amount. But that line, I guess, was the first one that distributed all the that interfered or in all the farmland that was being used in that area. I know that was a whole area of farming facilities that were there, and a lot of families lived off the farms, and the line came through, and again it divided the properties into different sections. You know, people weren't. Of course, it was accessible, but when the government said, well, you can't do anything under the tower line, so it really was a barrier there. That's what I remember of that. I remember just the people opposing it or saying that they should be getting more compensation or getting more out of it.
The council didn't have no power at all. It was Indian Affairs and white Indian agents, I guess. Indian agents' boss, their boss, that would come and give the okay and come and talk to the owner of the property, because they had the maps and they had everything of. The Indian agent had every single property and he knew who owned it and how much they had. So he'd come over and they talked a little bit and wind up. At that time, the Indian agent was able to speak Mohawk, just like the priests when they came here.
It would cut the farms in two. As I said, you know, I remember people saying, well, I'm going to use it anyway, but because the lines were above the ground. But then again, there was a warning always not to do anything under those wires, because they were, you know, the electricity was giving off some kind of a wavelength.
Why in Kahnawake is everything have to be here? Why does it have to be here? I believe it was always cost. It was a lot cheaper to go to Indian Reserve. They go to see the federal government, and the federal government gave it to them for peanuts.
In 1943, Kahnawake land was again expropriated, this time by the Montreal Light, Heat and Power Consolidated, to build a temporary transmission line to safeguard the Montreal power supply in the event of an enemy attack for the duration of the war and for 1 year after. The line was located near the St. Lawrence River, east of the Mercier Bridge, and ran parallel to the CP Railway. That line is no longer in service. The Seaway expropriated the land where Line 3 was in 1955, so the Seaway still holds these lands.
Number 3 was a precautionary from the Second World War. If in the event that they were going to bomb anything, either in the city, because our lines went directly south, and so there was a precautionary thing that was put up, but was never used. And then with the hydro, it didn't. I don't know. It didn't really seem to bother a few people. It was only as the town expanded. See, when then the demand for land became greater, so then now there was more questions being asked about why did you do this?
I guess it was built in the 40s for like protection purposes in case the other line was damaged by the enemy, and that they would use this line as a safety line. But I'm not too familiar. I imagine that it was taken the same way as the other were taken. There was manipulation by hook or by crook, and that part of the land, as I stated often, it was a most valuable piece of land where our people used to use the river because it was close to the village, and it was accessible, and it was a bay, and in a bay you notice that a lot of natural fish and bird and wildlife would exist, so our people benefited from that.
In 1929, the Cedar Rapids Manufacturing and Power Company applied to the Department of Indian Affairs and Northern Development for the right-of-way to run another power transmission line across Kahnawà. Initial expropriation took place in 1930.
I think it was a new line. It was a more higher powered line, high-powered line. It was new, and it was larger towers, more electricity, and of course it too went through farmlands, and disturbed that because people were using their lands. It divided the lands, and this time it was a higher power of electricity going through, so really they told a lot of people to stay away from it and not to do anything underneath it. You couldn't build anything underneath, and I don't know how much it would affect the cattle and the animals that were grazing there, but I imagine it did. There was people hired to approach the individuals and without taking into consideration the wishes of the community. And I remember, I think that line was where, people owned the land, and the government, they told the government, you can't use my land, and the government said at that point in time, well, Indians only own 6 inches of the top of the land, and one of these old guys, he said, well, if that's the case, then build the towers underneath. That's an example that we believed that we owned all the land, but the government comes along again and there says, at that point in time, you only own 6 inches, and plows that.
One Kahnawà family has 4 towers on their property, located on the Chattagee-Kahnawà boundary. They say their land, between 200 and 300 acres, was taken and they never received proper compensation. And they keep a copy of the agreement with the Cedar Rapids Manufacturing and Power Company. In those days, the Williams family had a maple syrup farm, a racetrack, and an ice business.
To my grandfather, Louis Williams. He was the Iceman. They used to call him Louis Pamela, the Iceman. He had ice houses. He used to have a team of men, which was my father, my Uncle Charlie, and a few other men in town, and they would cut ice off the Johnson's Beach manually with a big saw. And they would cut it in squares and bring it in ice warehouses and store it with the sawdust. Each block of ice had sawdust on it. And then towards summer and all that, they would put blocks of ice on a hay wagon and take it and go around town, and they'd be saying, "Iceman, Iceman." So people who wanted ice in their old-fashioned refrigerators would buy the ice and put it in the top of the refrigerator, and it leaked down in the pan, up in the pot, in the back top of their ice box. My grandfather used to have a maple syrup farm. He had a racetrack there, and from the maple syrup farm, he used to save the dead wood and cut it and make shavings for his ice house, and he used to sell the wood for home use. You can build a house with it, or you could burn it, whatever. And he always used what the Creator gave us. That's what he lived off. He didn't have a production line or nothing,
According to Sandra McCumber, the signature that appears on the contract with the Cedar Rapids Manufacturing and Power Company looks suspicious.
My sister Eileen has a contract there, and it said it was a contract for 99 years and one lump sum. He received $1,100, and we've never heard or seen any of that money, or never heard from any of the companies that put up the lines. That contract doesn't look good to me, and I don't know. I have signatures of my grandfather, and it's not the same kind of signature. I think maybe it was a false thing that took place, because Indians long ago were very gullible, and I think maybe my grandfather was cheated.
In 1946, the Cedar Rapids Manufacturing and Power Company became Hydro-Quebec. In 1950, Hydro-Quebec applied to Indian Affairs for the expropriation to extend and double Line 2. The request was granted. From the 1950s to the 70s, Indian Affairs did not seek the return of hydro lands expropriated by the St. Lawrence Seaway Authority, nor did they object to the St. Lawrence Seaway Authority keeping the lands and leasing a portion to Hydro-Quebec.
And I remember my grandfather always used to be out there, and he used to say, you know, he says, I've lived here all my life, and he says, I can't even get electricity here. He says, maybe I should climb up there and tie a line to it.
For a while we got so angry we couldn't do nothing. Now we're trying to change the thinking and trying to make use of where we are. We're in very valuable property, showing by all these hydro lines coming through our property, seaways and bridges and everything. And they're always coming to our property because it's very valuable. It's a very crucial place in Canada. It's the heart of Canada, and we have to make use of it.
In the late 1960s, Hydro-Quebec approached the Seaway Authority to lease a strip of land along the south side of the Seaway. Hydro-Quebec negotiated with the Mohawk Council in Indian Affairs for a Section 28-2 permit, which was signed by Hydro and Council in 1972. The Minister of Indian Affairs did not sign the permit because the land was not reserve land. The Seaway Authority returned a portion of this strip to Kahnawà in 1976. Half of the tower footings were on Kahnawà lands. In 1996, the Seaway returned more of the strip, except under the Seaway and their access roads, and transferred their lease with Hydro-Quebec to Kahnawà. Also in 96, Hydro agreed to renegotiate a lease between Hydro-Quebec and Kahnawà.
They killed two birds with one stone, otherwise they expropriated all this land for their use. In about 1970s, the council fought back to get the land back, and over the 500 acres. They got the land back, and for the people in the community who don't know where Survival School is today, and Glendale owns, and the MIT commercial building. That was all expropriated, and all the Clay Mountains. There's 150 houses now in the Clay Mountains. All that was returned in '72 with $1 million in compensation, and it was agreed at the council of the day. But what happened, they did not turn back the lands where the hydro towers were or their hydro lines. So what they did, they expropriated land for a seaway. It's very clear it was only for a seaway. Now they've built these bridges and roads on our land, and then they turned back the land that they didn't use, but they didn't turn back the land for the hydro. So what they were doing all these years is their hydro has been paying the Seaway for their tower lines on our territory. Illegal act.
Well, the area around hydro line number 1 is what I remember of it as a little kid was that there used to be one tower. We looked out the kitchen window looking out to the east. There used to be one big tower that was in the middle of the field, and there was one there. And then if you went to, there was no window on the west side, so you had to go outside. And the neighbor, his property, there was a tower line on that side, and there was a parallel power lines that where our houses used to be, and those were the only two farms that were visible to each other at the time. And of course we had all our barns and the sheds and the everything that the equipment barns, everything else that was all around the house. They were there all the time that I knew of, and it was just something that was, they were there. It was just like a rock, and he couldn't do anything about it. He just farmed around it.
In 1997-98, the St. Lawrence Seaway Authority agreed to give back all of the land under Line 1 to Kahnawà, with the exception of small blocks under the seaway and over their access roads. The Seaway Authority lease with Hydro-Quebec was transferred to the Mohawk Council of Kahnawà. MCK negotiations with Hydro-Quebec led to a redrafting of a new lease agreement. But in 2002, Tawaduni Zakta asked for a halt on the lease while they negotiated with Hydro to relocate or bury the transmission lines and towers along the seaway for a tourism project.
But because of the existence of those towers, there's not much you can do there. And a negotiation had begun with Hydro-Quebec. That's when we found out that that was the Seaway that had turned it over to Hydro. And at the time we went after both the Seaway and Hydro, and we had some friends in the Seaway Corporation that eventually convinced Hydro-Quebec that, you know, the land should be turned over to Kahnawà and that they should begin compensating Kahnawà. And part of the discussions at that time, they said, well, while we have you at the table, we already started the discussions on moving those towers and burying them somewhere else, getting them out of the way. But that didn't go anywhere either, because it was a very expensive, I guess, proposal for them to have to do that. So it's lain there dormant since. So it's prevented us from any kind of development in that particular area.
It's like putting an arrow through your heart. What good is it going to do me? That's how much good it does to Kahnawà. Zero. All our land becomes useless underneath it because you cannot develop under hydro lines, and 100 feet on each side. There's electromagnetic radiation from it. So all this is it's for no benefit to our people, and it only benefits everybody else, and we're not even compensated for it.
Unless, of course, they look at any kind of alternative energy development, which is the modern thing now, like solar panel, wind energy that you can sell into the grid. It's there. It's another idea that possibly we could look at. But being Hydro-Quebec as they are, you know, they have no real desire to do anything like that with us. They set aside, you know, some consideration for Native people in the province of Quebec, but for something like that, I don't know. I don't see any benefit of it. Well, take it down and move it away, and so we can reuse the land again.
But the hydro towers came in handy in Kahnawà in the early 1990s.
During 1990, they helped us out because the Army used to use their helicopter to chase us on the river. But if you went under the tower lines, they wouldn't go anywhere near it. That's the only feeling I have about the tower lines, because there isn't a thing I can do about it, you know, other than go and cut them down. But then they'll just bring it back.
In recent years, Hydro-Quebec has paid compensation to the Mohawk Council of Kahnawà for the hydro towers and will be paying annual fees. But negotiations continue.